At family dinner, my stepmom said, "Money is for families to share." That night, my bank alerted me of unauthorized access. You know that feeling when you finally snap? When years of polite smiles and veiled comments curdle into something dark, and you realize the people you trust are actively trying to devour your future. I looked my father dead in the eyes and told him if I heard one more word from his wife about my money, I was going to rip their world apart. The air in that kitchen went dead silent. My stepmother's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, and my father, he looked at me like I was a stranger. That was the moment everything changed. I grew up believing families broke apart with shouting, slamming doors, and screaming matches the neighbors gossiped about. I never knew they could break slowly, one polite smile at a time. One delicate comment slipped under the table like a knife. My mother died when I was 14. Cancer. Fast, aggressive, unforgiving. One summer, she complained of a dull ache. By late fall, I was standing at her grave in borrowed, pinching shoes, listening to people tell me how strong I was. God, I hated that word. Strong meant you couldn't fall apart. Less than a year later, my father introduced us to Margaret Hale. She wasn't openly cruel. That was the problem. She smiled too much, whispered softly, and caressed my arm as if we were already intimate. She baked casseroles for neighbors, poured wine at dinner parties. Everyone liked her. Everyone said my father was so lucky to find happiness again. I was 18 then, old enough to know better, but still young enough to keep quiet. When I left for basic training 3 years later, my father hugged me tight, telling me how proud he was. Margaret Hale cried, just enough to look supportive without smudging her mascara. "We'll take care of everything here," she cooed. "You just focus on your future." I trusted her, or maybe I just needed to. The military taught me discipline, patience, control. It taught me to listen more than speak, to read a room, to be strategic. Those lessons saved me, even if I didn't realize it then. The first remark about my money came during my 3rd year. We were on a video call. Margaret Hale sat next to my father on the couch, her hand resting lightly on his knee, a silent claim. "You must be doing so well now," she remarked, a wide smile plastered on her face. "With your pay, your housing allowance, all those bonuses." I laughed it off. "I manage." She nodded. "Well, it's good to know the family has security." I didn't like the way she said family. The remarks continued, always cloaked as concern, always polite. "Have you considered long-term planning? Wouldn't it be easier if your father helped manage things while you're so young?" Money can be overwhelming. My father would nod gently, his gaze always averting mine. When I came home on leave, things had changed. My mother's old desk was gone, replaced by a sleek glass table Margaret Hale claimed made the room feel cleaner. My mom's file cabinet, holding everything from insurance papers to old birthday cards, had vanished. When I asked, Margaret Hale waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, those old things? We organized them. You don't have to worry about it." That's when I started to worry. One evening after dinner, Margaret Hale brought out dessert and casually suggested, "We should really talk about consolidating accounts. It just makes sense for families." I laid my fork down. "My accounts are fine." She just grinned. "Of course, dear. Just a thought." That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the faint outline on the wall where my mother's calendar once hung. I felt like a guest in my own home. The breaking point wasn't a shout. It arrived with papers. While on duty, I got an email notification from my bank. A security alert. Attempted access, wrong verification. My blood ran cold. No one had access to my information except me. When I called the bank, they asked if I'd recently authorized anyone to help with my finances. I hadn't. Then they mentioned a query linked to my father's address. Something inside me hardened. I went home 10 days later. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I watched. Margaret Hale talked more than usual about bills, investments, how expensive the house was. how my father deserved to relax after everything he'd been through. Finally, she said it. "Well, your money is already part of this household." I looked at my father. He didn't correct her. That's when I stood up, walked to the table, and delivered the words that had been brewing in my chest for years, calmly, clearly, without rage. "If I hear another word from your wife about my money," I told him, locking eyes, "there will be no more nice chats. I'll explain exactly where she stands and why my money isn't hers. Do you understand?" Margaret Hale's smile vanished. My father's face went white. He nodded almost imperceptibly, but I knew. Comprehension wasn't respect, and I was done asking for respect. I didn't expect things to change overnight. People like Margaret Hale don't retreat when confronted. They adjust. They give a tighter smile. They wait for a better angle. For weeks it was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret Hale stopped mentioning money directly. Instead, she spun long, meandering tales about stress, responsibilities, and how difficult it was to keep everything together while I was away. She never asked for anything outright. She didn't have to. The insinuation hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Meanwhile, my father seemed to shrink. I saw it in the way he deferred to her in conversations, how he'd glance at her before answering even basic questions. I'd catch him mid-sentence, changing direction because she shifted in her seat or cleared her throat. It was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. The military had taught me something vital. Control isn't always achieved through force. Conditioning is, often the more powerful weapon. Margaret Hale tested the boundary again, but not at home. It was at a family gathering, one of those long dinners where distant relatives appeared, pretending we were closer than we actually were. Too much food, too much wine, just enough time for old resentments to simmer. I was sitting at the table when Margaret Hale laughed softly and told my aunt, "Well, with her military income, we're very lucky. Not many families have that kind of stability these days." My fork paused midair. I didn't look at her. I looked at my father. He was smiling. "She's doing well." That was it. That was the crack. Later that night, I pulled him aside. We stood in the hallway outside my old bedroom. The door closed, muffling the sounds of conversation. "I set a boundary," I said softly. "She crossed it." "She was just talking," he sighed, massaging his forehead. "You're reading too much into it." "I'm reading exactly what's there," I countered. "And I'm asking you, just once, to handle it." He exhaled. "You don't understand how complicated things are." That sentence explained everything. Complicated. Usually meant excuses had already been made. A few days later, another bank alert. This wasn't an access attempt. It was a request for information about a beneficiary. Someone had inquired about adding an authorized user. I didn't confront them. I documented everything. Dates, times, statements, conversations, emails, screenshots. I'd learned long ago that emotions dissipate. Records do not. Margaret Hale grew bolder, interpreting my silence as capitulation. She started phrasing her statements as jokes. "Be careful," she'd giggle, "or she'll cut us off." Everyone laughed. I didn't. One evening, she handed my father a stack of papers on the kitchen counter. "These are just estimations," she chirped. I figured we could look over options together. I recognized the logo on the top page, my bank. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house breathe, the pipes creak, the AC cycle. I stared at the ceiling, feeling something settle within me. Not anger, but clarity. The next morning, I went for a pre-dawn run. The cold air scorched my lungs, keeping them steady, grounded. With each stride, I relived everything I'd seen, everything I'd avoided because it was easier than facing the truth. Margaret Hale didn't want aid. She wanted control, and my father let her take it. When I returned, she was already dressed, drinking coffee at the counter. She smiled. "Morning," she chirped. "Sleep well." "Fine," I said. She tilted her head. "You've been quiet lately." "I have been listening." Her smile flickered for a second. That afternoon, I made my first call. Not to my father, not to Margaret Hale, to a legal aid agency. I didn't give names at first, just outlined facts, hypotheses, possibilities. The calm voice on the other end listened, then asked a question that tied my stomach in knots. Did you approve any of this? No. Then you are right to be concerned. Concerned, not dramatic, not paranoid, validated. By the time I hung up, the shape of what I needed to do was crystal clear. I wasn't going to argue with Margaret Hale. I wasn't going to plead with my father. And I wasn't going to wait for another boundary to be crossed. I was going to prepare. Margaret Hale made one last attempt that evening, soft and calculating. You know, she added, putting her hand on my arm, we do everything for this family. I met her gaze. My money is not. Her hand dropped. She didn't say anything else. But as I walked away, I felt it, the shift, the knowledge that I wasn't just pushing back. I was no longer manageable. And that terrified her more than anything I could say, because people like Margaret Hale aren't afraid of confrontation. They're afraid of losing their leverage. I didn't discover the truth all at once. It came in fragments, little everyday items that only became dangerous when put together. The first was a letter not meant for me. It arrived while I was back at base, forwarded from my father's address. The envelope had been opened and sloppily resealed before being thrown into the outgoing mail pile as an afterthought. Inside was a note from a credit card company, thanking my father for his recent inquiry about balance transfers and authorized users. The name on the account wasn't his. It was mine. I sat on the edge of my bunk, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, feeling that cold, unmistakable sensation crawl up my spine. Not fear, but recognition. The kind you get when something you suspected finally stares you in the face. I dialed the number on the letter. The representative, calm and professional, confirmed what I already knew. Someone had used my personal details to explore account access options. Not successfully, yet but deliberately. Is there a reason someone would think they could do that? She asked. I remembered Margaret Hale's touch, my father's silence, the word family, used as a key. No, I said. There isn't. I secured everything that afternoon. New passwords, security questions, verbal passcodes. I flagged my accounts for increased monitoring. You did the right thing by calling early, she said. Early? That word lingered, implying how much worse it could have been. The next piece clicked into place during my next trip home. I was looking for an old notebook where my mother kept lists. Nothing important, just something to make the place feel less strange. I checked the hall closet, then the drawer under the phone. Finally, I opened the small cupboard in the study. That's where I found the folder. It wasn't hidden. That was their mistake. It sat on the middle shelf, nestled between old home guides and tax reports, labeled in precise handwriting, planning. Inside were printed emails, budget drafts, debt projections, and a list of assets. Specifically my assets. My name appeared repeatedly, neatly printed at the top of pages I'd never seen before. Notes in the margins mentioned temporary moves, family use, eventual consolidation. My throat went dry. I stood there, folder open, listening to Margaret Hale moving around the kitchen, plates clinking, water running, the everyday music of a house that no longer felt like one. A single page silenced me, a handwritten note, folded and tucked behind a spreadsheet. It read, "She will not say no forever. When she understands responsibility, she'll see it's better this way." No signature, none needed. I carefully closed the folder, put it back, and quietly slipped out of the study. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. Over dinner that night, Margaret Hale talked about rising costs, inflation, the unpredictability of the future. She spoke with the practiced cadence of someone laying groundwork, not asking permission. My father nodded. I watched them both, remembering all the years I'd excused his stillness, his kindness. How many times I'd told myself he was just tired or grieving or trying to keep the peace. Peace, I realized, was expensive. and I was the one being asked to pay for it. Later that evening, my father knocked on my door. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, his eyes tired. "Your stepmother said you seemed distant," he told me. "I didn't invite him in." "I found the folder," I said. He tensed. "You went through our belongings." I recognized my own name, I explained, referring to arrangements I hadn't made. He breathed slowly. She was just thinking ahead. "For whom?" "She's worried about the house. About us." "So, what about me?" He looked away. That was my answer. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it. Not fury, not grief, just a dull ache from clarity. The realization that my father wasn't being influenced. He was participating. The next morning, I called the fraud department. This time, no hypotheticals. I described the letters, the inquiries, the documents, the handwritten note, the addresses. The tone on the other end changed immediately. "Don't confront them," the agent advised. "Continue documenting. We will open a file." A file? It sounded so official, and it carried weight. By the time I returned to base, I had a system. I scanned every document, photographed handwritten notes, preserved emails and documented conversations, dates, times, exact phrasing, copies in 2 secure locations. I learned the laws relevant to my accounts, my state, my situation. The military had taught me to prepare for contingencies, and I was doing it. Margaret Hale saw the difference before my father did. "You've been really busy," she said over the phone, her voice light. "You hardly tell us anything anymore." "I'm focused," I said. "That's good," she remarked. "We all need to do our share." I almost laughed. Instead, I ended the call and logged her statements in my journal. The final piece arrived unexpectedly. An email from a loan officer, accidentally forwarded to me instead of my father. A brief apology, followed by an attachment, a draft application. Collateral. Detailed estimated future income. Mine. That's when I knew. This wasn't overkill. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy, and strategies could be dismantled. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, the rhythmic breathing, the hum of fluorescent lights. I remembered my mother, how meticulous she'd been, how she labeled everything, how she used to say preparation was a form of love. I finally understood what she meant. By daybreak, the anguish had transformed into resolution. They thought my silence was consent. They assumed my distance meant I was stupid. They were wrong. They were about to find out just how wrong. I didn't change my behavior right away. That would have been too obvious. People who assume control panic when they sense resistance, and panic makes them sloppy. But only if they're first made to feel safe. So I remained polite. I answered Margaret Hale's calls. I responded to my father's messages. During video chats, I smiled and talked about work, avoiding specifics. I asked about the house, their health, topics that made me seem interested but gave nothing away. Inside, I was building something precise. Every morning before work, I reviewed my notes, dates, times, statements, the language Margaret Hale used when she thought she was being subtle. My father's deference instead of intervention. I treated it like intelligence. Verify, confirm, document. Emotion was useless here. Structure was everything. I opened a new account with a different bank, one my family had never used. I redirected my deposits. I set up alerts on every existing account. I froze my credit. When the confirmation emails arrived, I saved them in a folder labeled simply Evidence. I contacted legal assistance again, this time with specifics, names, documents, screenshots. The officer didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "This is attempted financial exploitation." Hearing it said aloud, it hit me. It removed the final layer of doubt. This wasn't a family conflict. This was calculated misconduct. "What are my options?" I asked. He outlined them clearly. Civil remedies, protective measures, and, if necessary, criminal escalation. He emphasized choice and control. You decide how far this goes, he explained. That night, I called the bank again. Not the general line, but the fraud unit handling my case. I asked questions. I learned procedures, timelines, which types of documentation were critical, which were ignored. Margaret Hale messaged me while I was on the phone. Just checking in. Your father's been stressed. We're all worried about you. I saved it. The next step was the hardest. I had to let them believe it was working. I casually mentioned that doing everything alone was exhausting. I said I was overwhelmed. Margaret Hale heard uncertainty in my voice for the first time. She leaned in immediately. You don't have to do this on your own, she said gently. Families share burdens. I understand, I replied. I'm just not sure where to start. Her voice grew warmer. Your father can help. We both can. That's when I realized she thought she had one. Over the next few weeks, she pushed carefully. A suggestion here, a form there, a remark about how much easier it would be if everything was centralized. She framed it as support, but the paperwork told a different story. Every attempt was logged in my file. My father avoided my gaze whenever the subject came up. He never stopped her. His silence became its own record. I started rehearsing the conversation I knew was coming. Not emotionally, but strategically. What I would and wouldn't say. Where I'd pause. Where I'd let silence do the work. I chose the setting deliberately. A family dinner. Neutral ground. Witnesses close enough to matter, but not enough to turn it into theater. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted clarity. Margaret Hale looked stunning that evening. She always was when she felt in control. She discussed future stability, how proud she was of our girl. Halfway through dessert, she brought it up. We've been thinking, she said, looking at my father. Maybe it's time to formalize some things. I set down my spoon. What things? I asked. She smiled. Just precautions in case something happens. To whom? I asked. She hesitated. To each of us. I nodded slowly. I have already secured my accounts. Her smile wavered. Oh, yes, I said. And I've spoken with my bank and legal counsel. The table went quiet. My father's face had lost its color. Margaret Hale's eyes sharpened. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice light but strained. Because someone attempted to access my finances without my permission, I stated evenly. She laughed softly. That sounds dramatic. It is documented, I replied. Silence. I warned you. I continued, turning to my father. I set a boundary. It was crossed. He swallowed. We were simply trying to help. You were trying to make a decision for me, I said. There is a difference. Margaret Hale leaned back, her expression cool. You are overreacting. No, I replied. I am prepared. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply told them that the quiet version of myself was no longer present. After dinner, Margaret Hale tried to corner me in the kitchen. You are turning this into something ugly, she hissed. It already was, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. She looked at me, calculating. You think you have power here? I know I do, I replied. That was the first time she looked scared, because she realized what my father didn't. I wasn't bluffing and I wasn't emotional. I was methodical, and methodical people don't stop once they begin. Margaret Hale suggested dinner again. She framed it as reconciliation, which should have been my first clue. People who have wronged you rarely seek peace unless they're trying to regain ground. She suggested inviting the extended family, my aunt, a cousin who always asked invasive questions, and a few family friends who remembered me as a quiet child. It'll be nice, Margaret Hale said over the phone. An opportunity to reconnect. We're all under a lot of stress lately. Stress was her code word for leverage. I agreed immediately. It surprised her. I could hear it in the pause before her response, the way she recalibrated. Good, she replied. I'll make your favorite. I didn't correct her. She could never remember what that was. The evening arrived, crisp and cool, the kind of autumn night that fills a house with the scent of roasted vegetables and cinnamon. Margaret Hale had set the table meticulously, candles perfectly spaced, her fine china laid out like a stage. She wore a cream-colored sweater that made her look soft, approachable. My father hovered near the sink, drying the same glass repeatedly. Guests arrived in groups, coats and chatter filling the hallway. Hugs and compliments were exchanged. Someone mentioned how proud they were I was serving my country. Margaret Hale seized the moment. "She's doing very well," she said cheerfully. "We're very grateful. Not many families have that level of security." There it was again. I caught my father's eye. He looked away. Dinner proceeded slowly. Stories, laughter, the clink of silverware. Margaret Hale effortlessly steered conversations, always circling back to responsibility, planning, the importance of thinking ahead. I waited. It came during dessert. My aunt smiled as she said, "So, do you plan to stay in the military indefinitely?" "Perhaps," I replied. "I enjoy what I do." Margaret Hale nodded. "And with that kind of income, she'll have plenty of options." I set down my fork. "What kind of options?" I asked. She blinked. "Well, investing, helping family, making sure everyone is taken care of." The table went quiet, not tense, curious. I reached into my bag and set a slim envelope on the table between us. Margaret Hale's eyes immediately fixed on it. "What is that?" she asked. "A summary," I said. "I've recently engaged in some financial activity." My father stiffened. Margaret Hale laughed lightly. "Is now really the time?" "I think it's the perfect time," I replied. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't slide papers across the table. I let it sit there, closed, its weight heavier than anything inside. "My bank has contacted me," I continued calmly. "There have been numerous attempts to access my accounts, requests for information, draft applications, none of which were authorized." The room became utterly still. My aunt looked at us, uncertain. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret Hale quickly interjected. "That sounds like a mistake. Banks make errors frequently." "Not like this," I replied. "Not repeatedly." My father finally spoke. "We can discuss this later." "I'm comfortable discussing it now," I said, "because it's already been discussed publicly." Margaret Hale's jaw tightened. "I opened a file," I continued, "with the fraud department, and I've sought legal counsel." There was the shift, the moment when the air changed. Margaret Hale's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. She took a slow sip, her smile rigid. "This is unnecessary," she stated. "We are family." "That's precisely why it matters," I responded. Nobody spoke. The candles flickered. I turned to my father. "I warned you. I set a boundary. It was crossed." He looked down at his plate. "I'm not accusing anyone tonight," I stated. "I am informing you. A professional meeting is planned for the near future. We will discuss what happens next." Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the raw calculation beneath. "You are threatening us." "No," I said. "I'm providing clarity." The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Conversations resumed, forced and awkward. People avoided my gaze. As guests left, Margaret Hale hugged them tightly, her smile unwavering. Anyone watching would have thought the evening had gone perfectly. As the last car drove away, Margaret Hale spun on me. "You humiliated me," she hissed. "I told the truth," I answered. "You did this on purpose." "Yes." My father stood between us. His shoulders slumped. "Can we just calm down?" "I am calm," I replied. Margaret Hale laughed, sharp and brutal. "That's the point. You think you've won something." "I think you understand now," I told her. "And that's enough for tonight." She stared at the envelope still on the table. "What's inside it?" "You'll see at the meeting." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. That night, I got the best sleep I'd had in months. Because here's the deal with leverage. Once it's exposed, it stops working. Margaret Hale knew it. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30 on a Wednesday. Not at the house. Not at a cafe. Neutral ground. An office with glass walls and minimalist art, designed to keep emotions from staining the furniture. I chose it deliberately. Emotions blur edges. Paper sharpens them. My father arrived first. He looked older, his shoulders hunched, his tie knotted too tightly, as if he'd pulled it that way to remind himself he was still in control of something. He nodded at me, a stiff, uncertain gesture. Margaret Hale arrived nearly 5 minutes late, wearing a dark blazer and heels that clicked sharply, announcing her presence. She smiled at the receptionist, at the framed certificates, at everyone except me. We sat. The mediator introduced herself. Then the attorney I'd retained. Quiet, precise, a woman who spoke only when necessary. I noticed Margaret Hale watching her hands instead of her face. That told me something. Let's begin, the mediator said. I didn't speak first. Margaret Hale did. This is all very dramatic, she said lightly. We're here because of a misunderstanding. My attorney slid a folder across the table. It's documented, she said. Margaret Hale's smile tightened. The mediator cleared her throat. Perhaps we should start with the facts. So we did. The timeline, dates, attempted access, unauthorized inquiries, draft applications, the handwritten note, the collateral listing estimated future income, mine. Each item presented calmly, methodically. No accusations, no raised voices, just facts. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Margaret Hale shifted in her chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs. This doesn't prove intent, she said. People plan. For other people's money, my attorney asked. Silence. The mediator turned to me. What outcome are you seeking? I took a breath. I had rehearsed this. Not the words, but the steadiness. First, I said, a formal acknowledgement that my finances are mine alone. No shared access. No inquiries. No future planning without my written consent. Margaret Hale opened her mouth, then closed it. Second, I continued, a signed statement confirming that any prior attempts to access or leverage my accounts were unauthorized. My father flinched. Third, I said, a commitment that my name, income, and expected future earnings will not be used in any financial discussions, applications, or representations going forward. Margaret Hale leaned forward. And if we don't agree? I met her gaze. Then the fraud file moves forward. The room went very quiet. My father finally spoke. You do that to us? I looked at him. I already did it to protect myself. He rubbed his face with both hands. We were just trying to make things easier. For whom? I asked. He didn't answer. The mediator interjected gently. There are alternatives to escalation. Settlement. Boundaries. That's what I'm offering, I said. Margaret Hale laughed softly. You're enjoying this? No, I replied. I'm ending it. She turned to my father. You're going to let her do this? He hesitated. That hesitation, the space where he should have defended me years ago, was all the confirmation I needed. My attorney placed another document on the table. This outlines the terms, she said. If signed, no further action will be taken. Margaret Hale scanned the page quickly. Her face changed as she read. This limits us, she said sharply. It protects me, I replied. And what about family, she demanded. Family doesn't require access to my accounts, I said. She looked at my father again. Say something. He swallowed. Margaret, maybe we should just sign. Her head snapped toward him. After everything I've done for you? The mediator raised a hand. Let's keep this productive. Margaret Hale leaned back, her composure cracking. You're choosing her over me. My father stared at the table. I'm choosing to stop this from getting worse. She laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. You always do this. You retreat. I watched them, detached, as if observing a pattern finally visible from the outside. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I said. I'm drawing a line. The mediator slid the pen across the table. Margaret Hale didn't reach for it. My father did. Wait, she said. If we sign this, what happens? The matter ends here, my attorney replied, provided there are no further violations. Margaret Hale's fingers curled into her palm. And if we don't? Then the documentation is forwarded, I said. She stared at me, really looked at me, for the first time without calculation. You think you're so disciplined, she said quietly, so controlled. I am, I replied. That's why this works. She turned away, jaw tight. My father signed first. The sound of the pen on paper was louder than I expected. Margaret Hale stared at the document for a long moment, then snatched the pen and signed with a sharp, angry stroke. The mediator collected the papers. Thank you, she said. We'll finalize this. As we stood, my father lingered. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I shook my head. Not today. Margaret Hale walked past us without a word, her heels echoing down the hallway, each step heavy with something like defeat. Outside, the air was cool and clear. I took a breath and felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, exactly, but completion. I hadn't won. I had concluded, and sometimes that was better. The silence afterward was unfamiliar, not the awkward kind that followed arguments, or the brittle quiet that settled over a room when someone refused to apologize. This was different. It was clean, unoccupied, like a space that had finally been cleared of furniture you never chose in the first place. I returned to base 3 days later. The drive was long, stretching through flat highways and early morning fog. I kept the radio off. I wanted to hear my own thoughts, to test how they sounded now that I wasn't constantly defending myself inside my head. They were quieter. My father sent a short message that week. Just a few words. I hope you're fine. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Anger would have required energy I no longer wanted to give, but because the message was incomplete. Hope without accountability was just another form of avoidance. I had spent years filling in gaps for him. I was done. Margaret Hale didn't reach out at all. I learned later, through a well-meaning relative, that she was telling people I'd become cold, that the military had changed me, that I'd turned money into something ugly. I let her have that story. People like Margaret Hale needed narratives. They needed to be wronged, misunderstood, diminished by forces beyond their control. I didn't need to correct her. Anyone who mattered had already seen enough. What surprised me most was how little I missed the house. I'd expected grief, nostalgia, a sense of loss for the place where I'd grown up. But when I thought about it, the house I missed hadn't truly existed for a long time. Not since my mother died. Everything after that had been a version edited by someone else. On my next free weekend, I drove to the cemetery. It was quiet, the grass trimmed neatly, the headstones catching the afternoon light. I brought nothing with me. No flowers. No prepared words. I didn't need them. I stood in front of my mother's grave and told her the truth. I handled it, I said softly. I didn't let them take what wasn't theirs. I thought about the girl I'd been when she died. How desperate I'd been to keep things together. How willing I'd been to disappear to make space for other people's comfort. I wished I could tell her that it hadn't been weakness. Just youth. Just love misdirected. I learned how to say no, I whispered, and how to mean it. The wind moved through the trees, gentle and steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to breathe. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. My finances stayed exactly where they belonged. My name stayed off everything that wasn't mine. The fraud file was closed, marked resolved. The folder labeled evidence went into storage untouched but available. Not a threat, just a reminder. My father tried once more, 5 months later. A voicemail this time. He sounded exhausted, older. I should have protected you, he said. I didn't. I'm sorry. I listened to it 3 times. Then I archived it. Apologies don't rebuild trust. They acknowledge damage after it's done. I wasn't cruel enough to deny him the chance to reflect, but I wasn't obligated to resume a relationship just because he finally understood the cost of his silence. Some lessons arrived late. That didn't make them my responsibility. The military gave me structure. My mother gave me values. And this experience, unwanted, exhausting, necessary, gave me something else entirely. Boundaries. Not walls. Not punishments. Just clear lines, drawn with intention. I didn't walk away with satisfaction. There was no victory lap, no dramatic sense of triumph. What I gained was quieter than that. I gained ownership of my life. I gained the understanding that respect didn't require permission, and that being difficult was sometimes just another word for being unwilling to be used. Most of all, I learned that family isn't defined by access. It's defined by care. Tell me, have you ever had to draw such a hard line with family? What did it cost you and what did you gain? I really want to know your thoughts on this.